Hello, glad you could join me. Today we will be taking a look at words, but not in the usual way. That's not what we do on this channel, is it? As usual, we shall be taking a slightly different approach to what most people believe is a rather pedestrian topic. We won't be talking about words in the same way as you normally would. Most likely when you were learning English at school, you were taught grammar, syntax and so on, which is the how. You learned how to use words. Today we'll consider the why. Why do we use words and why are they important? The motivation behind this video is a recent change to the editorial guidelines used by the BBC, in which the use of a particular word is discouraged in reporting. The offending word is terrorist, and the guidelines issued to editors, reporters and journalists is quite clear on the issue. And I quote, "Our policy is about achieving consistency and accuracy in our journalism. We recognise the existence and reality of terrorism. At this point in the 21st century, we could hardly do otherwise. Moreover, we don't change the word terrorist when quoting other people, but we try to avoid the word ourselves. Not because we are morally neutral towards terrorism, nor because we have any sympathy for the perpetrators of the inhumane atrocities, which all too often we have to report, but because terrorism is a difficult and emotive subject with significant political overtones." The reasoning proffered for this editorial direction appears to be that terrorism is a difficult and emotive subject with political overtones. Well, who'd have thought that? But excuse me if I seem overly simplistic, but isn't that precisely what terrorism is? An act designed to elicit a visceral, emotional response in pursuit of some ideological goal. This is dangerous and ill-considered linguistic trickery, and this is why we will adventure into the world of words and meaning. So the first thing to consider is, why words? We know they communicate our thoughts and feelings to others, but why? The simple answer is that most sentences we utter, with a few exceptions, are primarily intended to bring about change in the behaviour of others. This change might be emotional, cognitive or behavioural, but the intent is to bring about a change. For instance, the simple sentence, "Looks a bit grey outside, best take an umbrella," which seems pretty mundane. You've probably said something similar, but let's think about what's happening here. Firstly, the sentence is in the form of an argument. We could even have expressed it as such. Premise: it is grey outside. Hidden premise: when it is grey, it often rains. Conclusion: take an umbrella. This is an example of deductive reasoning. We have moved from a generalization about the weather to a specific conclusion: it will rain. And this argument informs an action, the taking of an umbrella. The hope is, of course, that the individual listens to and then follows our reasoning. We have brought about a small change. This might seem a trivial point, but it might be helpful to keep it in the back of our mind. Now let's talk about words, the T word in particular. Words are like the genes of communication. They are self-contained units of meaning. Different words have different functions, of course, but that's a topic for the English teacher and the linguist. We are concerned with communication and meaning, and the truth. If I were to say bureaucrat, you would have automatically recovered a stereotypical concept that matches the word. It would be richly descriptive. Some might even bring to mind an example of the type. A British person of a certain age might now be imagining Sir Humphrey as a proxy for all bureaucrats. So a single word can link complex concepts. This is why they're powerful. So now we come to the meat of the issue, the T word. There are many definitions of terrorism. If you read academic papers, it's sometimes difficult to know which particular definition the authors have settled on. But I think most people would recognise the simple fact that someone who used acts of extreme violence against the innocent for political or ideological reasons has committed an act of terrorism and is therefore a terrorist. That much, I hope, would be uncontentious. The detail we can set aside. Because there is no single definition of terrorism, sometimes we're not able to recognise whether the attack was an act of terrorism or not. The worrying thing is that even when someone commits an act that fits the definition, the police often classify the act as criminal rather than terrorist. This is even more prevalent in the media. Journalists are inclined to avoid the term terrorism and terrorist replacing these terms with euphemisms. And now the BBC itself is advising its journalists and editors to do exactly that. The word terrorism was first coined during the French Revolution's reign of terror, which was 1793-1794. This was a campaign of large-scale violence by the French state against its own people. It has come to be used in a derogatory sense. It has severely negative associations in the mind of more civilized people. But acts of terrorism existed long before the term itself was coined. Moses used terrorism against the Pharaoh. When journalists replace an emotionally charged word with a euphemism, make no mistake about it, regardless of intent, they commit an overt act of doublespeak. The term doublespeak was first coined by George Orwell in his book 1984. The book was set in a dystopian totalitarian future. William Lutz described doublespeak as, and I quote, "language designed to evade responsibility, to make the unpleasant appear pleasant, the unattractive to appear attractive. Basically, it's language that pretends to communicate, but really doesn't. It is a language designed to mislead while pretending not to. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, the official slogans of the party. Doublespeak is used to circumvent, deceive, distort, inflate, mislead, obfuscate. But let's think about doublespeak for a moment. How does it work in practice? There is more than one type of doublespeak, of course, but by far the most prevalent today is euphemism. We will have to qualify that in a while, but let's consider euphemism itself first. The word euphemism comes from the Greek. It means to speak with pleasing words. A euphemism replaces a word which is considered offensive, hurtful, or unpleasant. Euphemisms are often used by politicians and reporters, especially when dealing with contentious topics such as ethnicity, race, politics, and war. When used to obscure the truth, mislead or deceive, then euphemism becomes doublespeak. But we have to be wary because often euphemisms are valid when dealing with cultural taboo or to avoid or mitigate a painful reality for people we know and care about. When we hear euphemisms being used by our political overlords and those whose job it is to speak truth, then we should be wary. When journalists and politicians substitute the T word with militant, fighter or jihadist, and vans, trucks and cars commit terrorist acts, or Easter worshippers are victims of murderous violence, then there can be no mistaking the stench of doublespeak. The terms terrorist and terrorism are often swapped by media for terms like attacker, extremist, fundamentalist, guerrilla, insurgent, militant and fighter. However, these words have their own meaning. They do not describe terrorists. Terrorists might have extreme beliefs or perceive themselves as fighters, but when describing such people, the act itself is what defines them. Fighters target government institutions or military assets. Terrorists, on the other hand, target the innocent and the non-combatant. Their intent is to sow terror and destruction. They are not the same, and one should not be mistaken for the other. Militants are not afraid to use violence, but usually try to achieve their aims through intimidation, aggressive behaviour, or verbal abuse, but they will resort to violence if they believe it will achieve their ends. So while militants might resort to violence, unlike the terrorists, they don't need to do so. But violence itself is what defines the terrorist. Militant and terrorist are not describing the same thing. One should not be used to describe the other. We live in a world where the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attack was reported as 2 men killed 12 people in an attack on an office of a satirical magazine in Paris, which was how it was described in a BBC article, which is about as informative as claiming that 2 AK-47s killed 12 people in Paris, or that a truck killed 86 people in Nice. Can anyone not see how truly absurd this is? The media's embrace of doublespeak is a clumsy barrier to communicating the truth, thrown up with reckless disregard by those whose job it is to communicate the truth. They soften the meaning of words, and it allows them to obfuscate the real meaning behind the headlines. They attempt to deceive the reader or listener, and in doing so impede the reader's or viewer's ability to see what is really happening. The vocabulary of media doublespeak has become stocked with ready euphemism. there are over 20 such words just for the term terrorist. This deliberate obfuscation in the media and by our elected officials has a negative impact on our ability to distinguish terrorism from other criminal acts. If it goes unchecked, terrorism will become part and parcel of living in the West, in the same way as knife violence has become just another thing that happens in London. Do we really want to live in a world where trucks commit terrorist acts and terrorist acts are simply workplace violence? Words are important. They are how we communicate and affect change in others. Don't underestimate the potential damage that could be inflicted by those who attempt to engineer change by linguistic engineering and trickery. The next time you listen to the news or read a newspaper article, ask yourself why the journalist, politician or author used one word rather than another. Because, make no mistake about it, if you detect doublespeak, these people are in the business of changing your behaviour, because that is the only reason they would engage in it. You can be almost certain that they're uninterested in the truth. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Subscribestar page. If you're unable to support my work through Subscribestar, you can share, like or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.